So let's just jump straight into it. The last week we basically looked at what is interaction design, various bits and pieces, how to find, or how it's related to basically helping find solutions for users, how to identify those users, how to identify their needs, and then we started looking a little bit at how we can start sketching to explore our own ideas, communicate ideas to our clients, and so on and so forth. So now we're going to jump into turning these sketches into prototypes. So basically starting with just an idea and then actually creating something more tangible, something higher fidelity, something which actually starts to explore a problem rather than just presenting it in a very basic way. So I think we did flip through a few of these, didn't we?
Yep.
Right, I think we got to here, cool. So, prototyping. So, prototyping, we're looking at creating physical forms of ideas. So we want to allow people to experience and interact with them. Oftentimes and I guess we saw this example with the Nokia N-Gage, until people actually have a physical product that you're creating in their hands, it can be quite difficult to really sort of understand exactly what the experience is going to be like. So for the N-Gage, for example, it was probably sounded great on paper. It was a really powerful device. It was groundbreaking, revolutionary, but one minor flaw ended up making it an enormous flop. So while we prototype, gain empathy, so a deeper understanding of the design space, to explore an area, so you build to think. So once you create something, perhaps it will uncover things that you may not have otherwise thought of, or it might reveal problems to you, it might reveal new opportunities to you that you wouldn't have otherwise discovered just sort of looking at an idea on a piece of paper. Obviously testing, so you can test solutions with your end users, so you create something, you want to make sure that the solution is actually going to work or not. And then for inspiration as well, so if you give someone, and it's often a lot more, because it's a lot more tangible, it'll make them a lot more excited about the idea and what it is you're building, rather than just sort of saying, well, here's what I propose to do. And I guess I sort of mentioned that, that's sort of where things like Kickstarter and stuff come in. The ones which get funded are the ones which people have already started building something. So I think we've actually been through a few of these as well. Yes, we have. Anyway, I'm pretty sure this is where we're up to now. Hopefully. So types of prototypes. So we can have low fidelity prototypes, which is quick and dirty, easy access material like cardboard and paper. And as I mentioned sort of last week, it is one of these things where the difference between prototyping and sketching is it's more along the lines of a spectrum rather than two distinct things. And you see here in this diagram at the low fidelity end of this prototyping spectrum, we do see sketching here. So it's not black and white, the difference between sketching and prototyping. It's more sort of various shades of grey along that line, where sketching is sort of an early tool that you use to prototype. And then obviously, so that's obviously the low fidelity, and then moving into higher fidelity, so more involved electronic or physical versions, similar in materials to final products. So rather than drawing stuff on paper or perhaps building stuff out of Legos, you might want to start actually constructing stuff out of plastic using 3D printing or whatever, which we'll go into towards the end of this course. So I mean, here are a few sort of things you've seen here. So sketching and paper prototyping. So we've looked at sketching, paper prototyping. We looked at with the smartwatch thing where they had the little thing you could pull through and get an experience. Video prototyping we looked at a little bit. Wireframing we've looked at. Wizard of Oz prototyping we haven't looked at so much yet, but we will either today or Thursday. And then moving through interaction prototyping, semi-functional prototypes, and then onto functional prototypes. And then once you're at that point, hopefully you've nailed out all the kinks, and everything will be good to go into production, or you have an end product which is ready for your user. Prototyping tools, static low fidelity. So we looked at sketching already, storyboards and application flows, user interface templates. So these are all sort of stuff we've already looked at, like just drawing stuff out on paper and asking people to use them, and then basically trying to get some really it's static because it doesn't actually interact. You basically play the role of the system in this case. So you're showing people stuff, you're talking them through that, or asking them to talk through it with you, and getting the feedback from that. And then obviously moving into interactive and high fidelity. So these are tools which actually respond to the user, so they get a better impression of what the end system is going to be like. So you might talk about wireframing in there, mobile prototyping, so prototyping stuff on mobile phones. We'll look at a few examples of that soon, and native coding. These are obviously, again, software domain examples, but it's very similar in other physical or other prototypes, other application domains as well. They're just different tools. So yeah, low fidelity prototyping, and all of this is fairly straightforward. Low fidelity prototyping is a low cost. You can evaluate multiple design concepts. However, there's limited error checking. So if there's, for example, with the Engage, it wasn't looking at it on a piece of paper might not have made it immediately obvious that it was a poor design choice. And there's navigation and flow limitations as well. So if the person's just stepping through things on a piece of paper, they're not going to get a full impression of how the system actually works. Moving into high fidelity prototypes, obviously they're fully interactive. They have the look and the feel of the final product and clearly defines navigational scheme, or you can replace navigation on here with an interactive scheme basically. So they work in a more realistic way. They work more like what the end product will work like. However, they're more expensive to develop, they're more time consuming to build, and developers are reluctant to change something that they've crafted for hours. And we talked about this a little bit last week with the whole idea of sketching. Sketching should be quick and dirty, and it should be disposable. You should be ready to throw it away at any point in time, because you're really trying to more explore an idea rather than actually say this is what it is we're building. So ideally, one thing we sort of try and emphasize in this class, particularly in early stages, is rapid prototyping. So rapid prototyping is a design technique which is used to speed up the development of ideas, and it can take as little as a few minutes to make. So rapid prototyping is really just looking for the, fastest, cheapest, most expensive, easiest way to build a prototype. And that can be anything from just using Lego or something. It could be Play-Doh, plasticine, all these sorts of things. It's fast and inexpensive. It identifies problems before they're coded, elicits more and better feedback from users, helps developers think creatively, gets users and other stakeholders involved early in the process, fosters teamwork and communication, avoids opinion wars, helps decide design decisions. And I mean, if you look at these things here, all of these things are pretty much the same sort of things we talked about why sketching is good. So really, rapid prototyping is just taking that whole approach that Bill Buxton used to define what a sketch should be over a drawing and applying it to other prototyping methods as well. And we're going to have a look at a few coming up, more on the sort of web development, web tech, software development side of things, about how you can rapidly prototype interfaces which still give a higher level of, or still have a higher level of fidelity and a higher interaction than traditional sketching, and they're in the right context, in the right domain, so they're running on your mobile device or whatever, but they still have all these benefits. So yes, there's a fair bit of repetition in these slides, unfortunately, but we will go into some examples soon. So towards high fidelity prototypes, you're going to be looking at using materials that you expect to be in the final product. Prototypes look more like the final system than low fidelity. You might be using, if you're doing software, again, Macromedia, Director, Visual Basic, Smalltalk. So these two are programming languages. This is more like a sort of illustrative thing. But one of the things, I guess the most important thing to take off this slide is that there is the danger in building high fidelity prototypes that users think they have a full system. So we talked about compromises last week in prototyping. So you think you develop something for users, and you got to make sure that they're aware that they're not looking at a full system. Otherwise, you run the risk that they're going to be unhappy with what you've developed because it doesn't meet their needs. When in reality, all you're trying to do is explore either one concept very deeply or a range of concepts very shallowly. So we talked about this sort of deep versus broad prototyping last week, where the idea you usually prototype to either test one idea really thoroughly or test a range of ideas, but in a very shallow ways. Cool, so that's really more than anything, those slides we just covered are you can think of them more as a sort of recap of what we've been looking at so far. So now we're going to get into actually prototyping and some tools which may be useful to you guys, tools and techniques. So this is, I guess, what so far has been all recap, and now we're moving into actual new material. So paper prototyping, this is sort of really just an extension of sketching, and we've seen things like this already with some of the video examples. So I guess that was more video sketching, the Gutenberg library one where they had the guy pretending he was an agent on a computer, and they had bits of paper they stuck all over the box, which was meant to represent the screen. But paper prototyping, obviously very low fidelity still. It's a quick and simple means of sketching interfaces, so here the word sketching is not necessarily used to refer to sketching with a pen and paper, but more used as a synonym for low fidelity prototyping, essentially. And again, I apologise for the reuse and overuse of words, but I'm not the one who came up with these definitions, so we're just trying to follow along with sort of how the books define them. So using Office materials, it's easy to criticise and quick to change. It's a creative process, so you can develop in a team. And we always encourage you guys, particularly in your group projects, to do the entire sort of prototyping spectrum in the team as much as possible. So with the last year's group, for example, when they did paper prototyping, and I use it in inverted commas because they weren't actually using paper, they were doing stuff on the whiteboard, but they would all basically stand around a whiteboard with a pen and constantly changing and adapting stuff. And obviously the good thing about a whiteboard is that you can fill it, you take a photo, you wipe it all off, and you start again. And I think it's important to emphasise that you should be recording these as well. So we talked about one of the good things about sketches was that you can keep this record of what you've been working on. So obviously it's a little bit harder with a whiteboard. So I highly recommend taking photo snapshots as you're working on it before you. Don't ever rub anything out unless you've already made a record of it, because it may be one of those ideas that you want to revisit later on once you have a better understanding and more knowledge about the domain. So you can also use it for usability tests, so focusing on the flow of interaction rather than the visuals. So I talked about that example of the PhD student we had a few years ago who designed an interface for a game she was building, and it was all just stuff on paper, and she could check out how people's understanding of the system based on the UI would work by asking them to perform actions, and she just basically changed bits and pieces of paper on it. So that was essentially a usability test. She had an idea of how the user interface would work, and she was testing to see whether that design was understandable by people who weren't familiar with it, by just basically asking them to talk through how they would interact with the thing. And it's used lots to test out concepts before the redesign begins, and her experiment was a really good example of that. Again, she didn't actually design anything. She just whipped up some stuff in Photoshop and then tested it out, because she was really just interested in getting the idea right before she actually started building anything. So this is actually basically an example of the sort of thing that she did. Hers was slightly prettier, but same idea. So here's an example for somebody testing out. This looks pretty much like the rules and filters thing on Outlook if you guys have used it, but basically, you've got, you set rules and you say what should happen to various emails. So if the from line contains the subject lines, and this is obviously prototyping how this thing would work. So you say, okay, if the from line comes from these people, I want it to highlight the message in blue, so I can very quickly scroll through my emails and go, oh, that's an important one that's come from this group of people. So in this, you basically draw this stuff up, and you can see this has been just drawn by hand. So it's all not even used rulers or anything, very sort of quick and dirty sketching again. And then they've got these pop-ups. So you might imagine that in this thing, you'd say, okay, I want you to highlight all the emails which come from this person in a certain color, and then ask the people to step through. So they'd say, okay, well, I'm going to click on the from line contains people, and then when they say that, you would put this piece of paper out with, select the color for your message, and then they say, oh, okay, well, this looks like a drop-down list, so I'll press on that one, and then they'll put another piece of paper out here which shows here are the options they can do, and then they choose read and select. And this is the sort of thing which often you'll end up with just a bunch of icons which obviously suggest things, and then you just put them on the piece of paper as the person's going to create widgets and test out the design. And so this could obviously be driven by the designer. So you could be sitting there and augmenting the design as the person is stepping through it, or alternately it could be used by the person as well. So if you remember, on last Wednesday we looked at the woodblock example, and it was talking about how we get users to inform the design. It was saying, okay, they could stick, you give them a piece of wood representing a digital camera, and you give them a bunch of stickers saying, okay, this is the shutter button, this is the zoom in, this is the zoom out, and you ask them to stick these buttons somewhere on there. And so you could basically just provide the person with these things and say, okay, tell me where you think these icons would make most sense.
Just a question for the widgets.
Yeah.
When you stick it to them, then you will pop up the window. Like, would you stick that, and then would you show the interface, how the interface would look with that?
So are you talking about if the user's designing it, or?
The widgets.
Yeah, so these ones down the bottom here. Yeah. So what you'd probably be doing is you're basically taking the role of the system. So if it depends on the task what you're doing. If you show that and you ask the user to step through and they say, okay, I'll click on that button, then you would put the screen. Yeah. Yeah. So if you're asking, so with this one here, for example, at the example at the top, so they probably just have a piece of paper which was sitting there, and then the person, they're like, okay, I want you to have it that if it comes from this person, set it to red. So they're like, okay, I'd click on that, and then you get the little pop-up box and you put it on the piece of paper. And you say, okay, what would you do now? And they're like, oh, well, that looks like a drop-down menu, I'll click on there. And you're like, okay. And then you basically, so you are essentially acting as the system would. But it does depend on task. So as I was saying, if you're trying to elicit the user to design it, you might just say, okay, here is what the window looks like. Here are your icons. You put the icons where you would like them. And in that case, it's more you're trying to get the information from them about the layout rather than you sort of saying this is the system. So one is, you can use it either more as a sort of designing the interface tool or an exploring the interaction tool. And depending on which of those you use will be whether you control everything it does or you just leave it up to the user and hopefully they'll provide how they believe the system should work. So yeah, anyway, moving on. Basic materials for lo-fi. So post-it notes, index cards, scissors, X-Acto or craft knives. Overhead transparencies are quite a nice one because obviously you can layer them up and do some stuff. So we talked last week about sketching and how with sketching you may want to put annotations on, and you can use transparencies to overlay an annotation on something so you can elicit feedback before you actually provide people with the annotations. But obviously you can, using overhead transparencies, you can very quickly whip up, so you give someone a screen and they push on that button, you just put the next transparency on top, and that way they can see the thing behind. And obviously if you stick pieces of paper to the transparency, you can have almost like a flip book. So it's a good way of speeding stuff up. Large heavy white paper, tape, stick, glue, correction tape, pens and markers. So, it's nothing particularly exotic or unbelievable in this sort of stuff. It's just stuff you can find around. But it is really useful at sort of exploring concepts very quickly. So here's a nice little example using index cards. So each card represents a screen or part of a screen and can be used for website development. And obviously the good things about this is you can stick them in a little box and take them with you. So you can test this idea across multiple people very, very easily. And once you come back, you can provide this to a UI designer or a graphical designer, and they can whip up these things pretty straightforward. Here's a slightly more interesting example, which I thought was kind of cool. So this was I'm not actually sure who did this, but basically they were looking at sort of VRML text. So for those who don't know, that's virtual reality markup language. So it was basically supposed to be like 3D graphics on the web before anything actually came out of it. And they were looking at exploring how people would interact with this VRML technology. So, you go to this website and you want to buy a car, and it pops up and it's got a little model, and then you can click on it to drag it around and spin the model. So this is basically the end result of that. So they have a number of piece of data relayed. But you can imagine printing out 100 copies of this or something and testing it on 100 people, and then they've essentially just drawn all the lines on showing what the interaction is. But you can look at this and see, so each red dot is basically a click, so the person's just clicked and released, and each green line is a click and drag. So you can imagine just have your piece of paper and you give someone a pen, you say, okay, I want you to show me how you would rotate the model. So in this one, they want to rotate the car along the x-axis 45 degrees, so basically rotating the car like that. And they've asked people to go through it. So by looking at this, you can sort of see what the most common interactions are. So here, most people grab the front of the car, or it's a little bit hard to see on the projector, I apologise. But they sort of, most of the lines start at the front of the car and then move along the car. So for most people, they thought, okay, we've got this is basically what the screen said. So, sorry, I should have explained a bit clearer. This is what they see on the screen, and this is what they're trying to achieve, essentially. So most people were like, okay, well, I have a thing of a car, so I will interact with it like I would with if it was an actual physical object. I'll grab my phone and I'll spin it around. And most people have done that. A few people have done things. So you can see there's a couple of red dots out here where obviously people sort of, if I click on that side, it'll just rotate around like you would have an image slider with arrows at either end, and you push it and it rotates around. A few people didn't understand the exercise at all and actually drew on this model. But you're always going to get that, so that's fine. So really, what they were wanting people to do is show them on this drawing how they would make this car end up looking like this. And this is the same thing, but this time you're rotating the car 45 degrees around X and 20 degrees around Y. So basically taking this car and positioning it to look like that. And most people have done a similar thing, except now you can see, in this one, most people just drag the line from right to left. Whereas here they've dragged it from here, from this position to the sort of bottom left. So they've essentially seen the car like that, and they said, well, I'll grab it like that and rotate it down like that to get it into that position. Which is great. There is a fair amount of sort of consistency, and everyone's sort of using very similar actions. There's obviously a few people who've clicked in weird places and done weird stuff. But for the most part, people have looked at this interface and their initial reactions across a wide range of people have been fairly similar. So then what they thought they'd do is they'd try out a couple of different ones. So this is, again, this is exactly the same image as before, but now they put some buttons around it, or some arrows around it. So people now have there's still people who want to drag it, but now you can see there's a lot more red dots on the outside, particularly here. So there's a lot of red dots here, which people sort of see these arrows and they think, oh, if I click on that, it'll rotate the model. And same thing on the rotating around the X and Y. What's kind of interesting here is that people, there's been a lot of people who have clicked on either end. So there's obviously some confusion about, some people think if you click on the left one, it'll rotate the car to the left, whereas other people obviously think if you click on the right one, it will show you more to the right of the car. So perhaps this design here is better than this design here because there seems to be a lot more, stuck for the word, but a lot more agreement between the users essentially. So most users doing similar things here, whereas there seems to be a 50-50 split in this design where people think, oh, I'll click here or I'll click here. And then there was one more thing where they thought, well, let's try and support both. So let's have it that you've got the thing up here and then you've got like a navigational thing down here. And again, it hasn't really worked that well. So some people have tried to click and drag on the car, other people have clicked on the arrows. There seems to be a lot of people clicking on this side for some reason, or this down right arrow. But yeah, again, not a great design. Probably the best design was the one they started with. I don't actually know what order these pages were in. Oh, there we go, 1 out of 66, 4 out of 66. 48 out of 66, so I don't know the format of this document, but at least they put this one, which was the best one, at the front of the document, so they're probably arguing that this is the best design to go with as well over these ones. What order these were shown, I don't know, but I guess if nothing else, even if you think perhaps this isn't a great design, at least you've validated with the users that no, it's actually not a great design.
Yeah, right, it's probably from looking at it like a bird's eye view.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, so I guess that would actually make sense because people are assuming that this point here is the car and then all these arrows specify which direction the car should point. I wouldn't have got that myself, but good thinking. So yeah, that's basically a very, with essentially, you can imagine you could whip something like this up in a few minutes with a model of a car and a black background, but from that you've essentially evaluated 3 different user interface techniques, and you've got, you know, there's maybe 100 lines in this, so 100 users. Each user to evaluate these interfaces would take a matter of seconds. You know, you could spend 30 seconds including explanation to get this feedback from the user, and from that you have quite conclusive evidence that, hey, this is the best way to go. And you can take that to, and you know, these users may not necessarily be people who are your end user clients. Say you're developing a website for a car sales thing, you're not necessarily just going to test this on the people who work at the car sales yard. You might just go out to random people, but then you can come back to your client, who is the car sales people, and say, look, we tested this over 100 people, and by far and above, the highest user agreement was on this one interface. And then we've sort of seen some examples like this before, so paper prototyping with hardware. So you basically you start with some of these, and if you guys are ever interested, I assume, unless they got thrown out in the move, we do have a tub that big, which is full of old Nokia or old phones, not necessarily just Nokias. We don't have any, and well, we probably do have a few older Android phones in there, but you're not going to find a iPhone 6s or a Galaxy S5 in there. But we do have phones that, if you want to test out this sort of stuff on a device, we have hundreds of them. So yeah, but you get the idea. So basically, you've got post-it notes here. So at least the person is using the device in the correct form factor, or using the system in the correct form factor, sorry, so they can see what's going on, they can touch on stuff, and again, you, at playing the role of the system, can just basically change the post-it note, which is stuck to the interface. And that might also indicate other things as well. So if you just provided people with these post-it notes, they might say, okay, well, I'll tap on that, tap on that. However, obviously there's a bunch of physical buttons on this device as well, not so much on iPhones, but Android devices still usually have physical buttons, which people may use as well, which you wouldn't otherwise get if you just provided them with the paper prototype. So these are blank model prototypes. These are actually, I believe, from when Apple was working on their digital camera. And this is a sort of similar idea as they had to the that blank wooden block, essentially. So they have a bunch of stickers or even pieces of paper that you can just stick a bit of glue on and stick them on the device to try and determine where is the best place to put various buttons. So obviously there's a lot more effort put into creating these devices, but you're probably going to get more or better feedback from the users as well. But it's one of these sort of things, you don't want to jump in and start doing this too early, because you're going to be wasting your time when it's possible that you're solving the wrong problem, or you are reaching a local minima rather than a local maxima. A local maxima rather than a global maxima, as we looked at last week. So this one, by the looks of it, is just a plastic box that they got from anywhere. So it's always a good idea to, if you're doing your grocery shopping, instead of throwing things out for recycling, if something comes in a pickle box, it might be worth holding on to, because you'd be surprised at the sort of stuff you get as far as packaging, which can be really useful. And obviously with things like, we have 3D printers here, so you can imagine rather than making one of these out of paper, you could just 3D print one and do the same idea with stickers. And the good thing about 3D printing, obviously, is it's a lot easier to create duplicate copies of stuff. All right, so I mentioned there are a range of tools. How do we do with time? Running up. It's all right. There are a range of tools which we can use to do paper prototyping at a slightly higher fidelity, so exploring the context and stuff. And one of the ones which has always proven to be extremely popular is PopApp. So I'm just going to fire up this video. We have no audio, which is awesome. There we go. So we have PopApp. So PopApp, the idea behind it is you basically do regular paper prototyping, but then you can take photos of the paper prototyping that you're using, and you can actually link together the various bits of interaction as if it was a working screen. And it's all very simple. I'd highly recommend you guys between now and the next class to actually download this onto your device and give it a test, because it's really simple to get going. So this sort of shows the thing. So someone's just whipping up various pieces of interaction. They go along, grab some screenshots of it, and then you basically select an area and say, okay, link that to that slide there, and now you have essentially a working pop-up prototype app. Really simple, really cool. I'm pretty sure as well, if install it on your device, you can actually link, if you get your users to install on their device, you can actually just send them a link which they can click on, and it will open that experience on their device as well. So all of a sudden we've made paper prototyping not only digital and interactive, but it's also shareable. So if I want to test an idea with you guys, or rather I want to test an idea with people over in Australia and America and Europe and Asia, I can just send them a link and they can test it, and I can get a ton of feedback. And I'm sure, well, I haven't looked at it in that much depth, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if PopApp has some way of doing analytics as well, so you can basically see how various people have interacted with your system and see if they are using it in a way that you would expect. So a really cool idea, small little app, which makes life a lot easier. So we've just got a few more minutes, so we'll just blast through a few more bits and pieces. So obviously paper prototypes, quick and dirty, no software needed necessarily, but obviously there are things like PopApp which can make your life a bit easier, and it's very inclusive, so everyone can work on a paper prototype. You don't need to be a graphic designer, you don't need to be a software developer. Anyone can pick up a pen and a piece of paper and do some paper prototyping. Sometimes it's not quick enough, you can end up spending more time than you want, so you just have to be careful that you make sure you sketch or prototype to the level that is appropriate. So if you are just testing out some ideas, don't bother making everything really nice, don't bother using rulers and pens, and just do it all by hand. They can be too dirty, so they lack context and scale. Things like PopApp can help with context, so you can basically do something and run it on a mobile device, so at least somebody is using your mobile app on a mobile device. As far as scale, that just comes down to the scale of the experience, so you're not going to be able to prototype. If you're doing, a new database administration tool, you're probably not going to prototype the entire thing on paper, because that's going to be an absolute nightmare. So it can be quite a shallow sort of experience. Hard to share amongst team. Obviously, again, things like PopApp can help with that. And it still needs a separate documentation step. So unless you are documenting stuff as you go, you basically end up with a bunch of pieces of paper which may not have any reference in the real world. I'm guessing it's that time, is it? Yep.
Yeah, I think, I don't know where we're going, but we're going somewhere, right?
All right, well, Ken was going to come down, I think, and walk, or possibly walk people over. Actually, we'll just rip through wireframes and mock-ups. So I did mention last Thursday that I thought that the slides probably should have come later, and I was right. Earlier last week the week before that actually, I was rearranging the slides. And I moved half of the wireframe and mock-ups ones, but I left a couple behind by accident. So this is why we're seeing them again, because I realized after the lecture that I'd missed moving a couple of them across. So so basically wireframes and mock-ups, depending on where you want to go, they can fit anywhere between sketching and prototyping, but they're a nice sort of step in between often. If you think of this as your sketch on paper and this is your working prototype for a website. 2 minutes? 1 minute?
1 minute.
1 minute, all right, cool. So sketching, it's about getting the idea across, freehand drawing very quick. Wireframes and mock-ups basically take it a little bit further, focuses on navigation and functionality, explores one interaction but can be used as a foundation for development and testing prototypes. So it's about functional specs, navigation systems, functionality and layout, notes about the intended functionality, how interface elements work together, but there's no typographic style, colors or graphics. So you're leaving room for the design to be created. So we did look at wireframes a little bit, and these were, I think, the slides which were in last week's one. So here's a nice wireframe here, which sort of gives an idea of what the content is, but these are images, here's a movie, and it's all the lorem ipsum Latin text. So there's really no content that's being created there. It's more about a layout, and also more so about the navigation and the interaction. So you might sort of say to this person, right, from here I want you to find the attachment which the person sent in this one. And here are a few more showing various bits and pieces. So a website for the Asian American Institute, so you can imagine doing a similar thing for the HIT Lab website, showing how stuff works. And we saw these examples last week. So Balsamic is one, we'll come back and we'll look at these again on Thursday, or look at least the last couple of these on Thursday. Balsamic is a tool for creating wireframes really quickly. There's a YouTube link in there which we'll look at because we're just later because we're not going to have time. But yeah, so Balsamic basically is a drag and drop WYSIWYG wireframing thing where you can just basically take various interface elements, stick them in place, but it does actually allow you to do the interaction kind of like what we just saw with pop-ups. You can just sort of say, okay, when the person clicks on this, take them to this screen, or so on and so forth. And yeah, we'll stop there because there's more slides there than I remembered. So sorry again about the very short lecture today, but we will get through the rest of it.